may have heard the name Val Demings a lot lately. She's a Democratic congresswoman from Orlando, Florida. Demings began her career as a social worker, became a cop, and then rose to become chief of the Orlando Police Department, the first woman to do so. She's also on the short list of women Joe Biden is reportedly considering as his running mate. In a column in Friday's Washington Post, Demings wrote, "As a former woman in blue, let me begin with my brothers and sisters in blue. What in the hell are you doing?" And Val Demings, who joins me now from Orlando. Congressman Demings, welcome to Meet the Press. And let me start with simply this. We've been through this cycle before in America a lot this last decade. An incident like the one with George Floyd happens. There's outrage. The country has some sort of collective conversation about race and inequality. And then what happens? Not much changes. Why do you think that is the case? And what do you think is the possibility of making this time different?
Chuck, I really do believe that we can. You know, when I think about the extraordinary work that Dr. King did, for example, in the civil rights movement and those who were with them, look at where we are. It is a ever changing, commitment that we always have to make to deal with systemic racism in our country. I think before, as we've dealt with misconduct involving police officers, that we've always tried to deal with it as an individual department or an individual city or an individual state. But I do believe the time has certainly come. We are overdue for us to look at the problem as a nation. I think we all need to pause, and every law enforcement agency in this nation, whether they are 10 persons or 35,000 persons, need to review their hiring standards, their training standards, look at their de-escalation training that they're doing within the department, look at those officers who train other officers, because we know our training officers are the ones who set the standard for what's acceptable and unacceptable on the street. And we have to continue to work with our community leaders to build relationships, to foster trust. And we don't wait to do that, to when we're in the middle of a crisis. We have to continue to do that every day. And I do believe we are long overdue for every law enforcement agency in our nation to review itself and come out better than before.
Let me ask this, though. It does seem, look at Minneapolis. A lot of people have praised the police chief in Minneapolis. He was brought in after they've had some issues in the past. He was brought in to institute these reforms. But you've dealt with this as a chief. It's very hard if you've got a police officer that you think isn't on the up, it isn't good in certain situations. It's very hard for you to get rid of one of those police officers, is it not?
Let me say this, Chuck. As you know, I spent 27 years at the Orlando Police Department, had the honor of serving as the chief of police. I've worked with some of the brightest, the best, and most courageous men and women that America has to offer. Certainly, they were not all that way, but the overwhelming majority were. And so I commend the chief in Minnesota, because he did one thing that I certainly think helped to bring charges against one officer. We're waiting to see others, but that was to immediately fire that officer, which allowed the chief to do some things that otherwise they would not have been able to do. And so, while I know that it seemed like the days that passed before the officer was arrested, if you look historically, that was a pretty swift arrest that was made. And so I do believe working collectively, every sheriff, every police chief throughout the nation, working together and facing racism and other issues head on to make sure, what are they dealing with? Is it a bad mind? A person who should have never been a law enforcement officer in the beginning? Is it a bad heart? Because you certainly have to have the heart for this job. Or is it bad policy? And while I know the federal government does not have direct jurisdiction, I certainly believe that we do have a major role to play in terms of helping law enforcement agencies throughout the nation maybe come up with some standards for hiring and training, especially use of force training.
I want to go a little bigger picture here. In some ways, the last 3 months have been particularly hard on communities of color, but particularly the African American community. You look at the impact of the coronavirus on health outcomes, the impact of the virus on the economic picture. Now throw in 3 more just brutal examples of racial injustice on the law enforcement front. I'm referring to Georgia, Kentucky, and Minnesota in particular. What does that mean for governing going forward? Congressman Anthony Brown said to me that one of the things that has to change is no more. You can't have race-neutral policy right now. There actually has to be direct help, direct aid to African American communities to sort of fix these injustices. Where are you on this?
Well, let's think about it. President Johnson looked at policing, for example, in America over 50 years ago. And what he said basically is what I just said: hire the brightest and the best, make sure they're well trained, and they have the tools to do an effective job and work closely with the citizens. But he also said, but we have to address those social ills that cause decay in African American communities in the first place. We have to look at economic development. We have to look at jobs. We have to look at wages. We have to look at education. And, some believe that, in order to be fair, if you will, that you treat communities the same. Well, it's not that simple unless communities all start in the same place. And we know that's not true. Look at the coronavirus. It's something that we've never seen before that requires us to do some things we have never done before. But racism in America and the injustices that comes with it is nothing new. And so we have to get serious about, number one, admitting there is an issue, and number two, working together. And Chuck, it certainly would help if we had leadership at the top. If there was ever a time we need leadership in the White House, it is now, to help heal our nation. But I don't know why I would expect this president to do something that he has never done before and we have never seen before.
All right, but let me ask the question this way about President Trump. If he called you up tonight after watching you here and said, look, help me say something to fix this, what would you tell him to say?
I would tell him to begin with showing some compassion for the persons the families that have lost their loved one. Let's start there. And then continue to talk about America is great and wonderful because of the beautiful diversity that we have in this country, that we are a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of laws, but we're a nation of immigrants, and we have to work together. And let's look at our history. This country has already solved some of the toughest issues because we have been able to come together and work together. We can do that now. And maybe if he ends, and look, Chuck, if he called me today, I would welcome the opportunity to help this president get it right. And maybe we begin today by acknowledging the sins of the past and even said things that he has said and done that caused harm and brought pain to the American people.
All right, Congresswoman Val Demings, I got to leave it there. Thanks for sharing your perspective with us.
Thanks, Chuck.
When we